Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're comparing 2017's AMD RX 580 with 2022's RX 6500 XT. I wanted to pop up at the start of this video because there are a few things to mention. The first is the price. Now you can actually find both of these in 2025 for less than $100 or pounds. At least you can the RX 580, that's certainly more common at this price point. There are a few 6500 XTs I've noticed on eBay for very similar money, and personally I wouldn't pay more than £100 or dollars for either of these. The second is that the 5080, not on this channel. The 580 I'm using is the 8GB version, and there is a 6500 XT with 8GB. There are a couple of models actually, but it is so hard to find. I've not seen one here in the UK, and I think the 6500 XT 4GB is certainly going to be the more common one that you'll find. So that's the card we're testing today, of course. The third thing is drivers. Now, the 580 hasn't had an updated driver since late last year. I think it's 24.9.1 is the latest version. That's the version I'm using in today's video. The 6500 XT, on the other hand, received a driver update not long ago, version 25.something.something. I'll put it up on screen. Without further ado, let's get into it and see how these two graphics cards compare in 2025 when playing some of the latest games. Alright, so we're going to start with Baldur's Gate 3. Bit of an issue with this one, not for the 6500 XT, but for the 580. Now, I tested this with Vulkan first of all, and the 6500 XT played the game, but there were a few problems. Not as many as the 580 though, because this crashed every time with Vulkan, so I had to actually retest with DX11 instead. Now, this actually made performance better on the 6500 XT, and it meant that the 580 could run it, but with a lot of stutter. Before, I wasn't getting any stutter, but it was crashing, so couldn't really win with Vulkan. But with DX11, we have 65 frames per second for the 6500 XT 4GB, a 1% low of 34 and a 0.1% low of 28. With the 580, we have an average of 55, but the percentile lows are a lot worse. There was a lot of stutter here in DX11 mode. 22 FPS was that 1% figure, and then the 0.1% figure was 13. So playable, but a little bit all over the place. I want to move on to Black Myth Wukong next at low settings with 100% scaling. I haven't used any upscaling throughout the entirety of this video. This is pure native performance, just like in the good old days. The 6500 XT hit 43 frames per second with a 1% low of 38 and a 0.1% low of 31. For the RX 580, I have to say it was very close. This has double the VRAM, of course, but even so, it's an older card, driver support is limited, and because of this, we saw 42 frames per second. So I still think it's a pretty decent effort. It's keeping up with the newer card. The average is pretty much the same. This is within margin of error territory. The 1% low was 37 this time around compared to 38, and the 0.1% figures were the same at 31. So I'm going to say that this is pretty much identical performance with both the 6500 XT 4GB and the RX 580 8GB. It's important to note, however, that the 6500 XT is running in PCIe 4.0 mode, and if you're using it in a PCIe 3.0 system, which could be very likely, then it is going to perform worse, depending on the game, of course. As we move on to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 then, I'd like to remind you that this is very much a best case scenario setup for the 6500 XT. For this one, we were running at 1080p low. I think the game still looks fantastic. It's a very well optimized title. With the low settings in the 6500 XT 4GB, we were seeing 45 frames per second with a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 36. So pretty consistent here for the 6500 XT. I also left the anti-aliasing at default, SMAA 2TX. The RX 580 actually pulled ahead here, I think, thanks to that increased VRAM. 53 frames per second here with a 1% low of 43 and a 0.1% low of 41. So again, a very consistent experience, but overall a better one on the RX 580. I'm walking through a pretty intensive part of the game here, the countryside forests, and it looks absolutely beautiful, even on the low settings in my opinion. It's nice to have a game that runs so well in 2025, even on older hardware like this. The 580 is actually one of the minimum spec graphics cards that we've tested previously in a minimum spec build for KCD2 as well. I'm testing Red Dead Redemption next, not 2. This is the original game that came to PC in 2024, finally at 1080p Ultra with FSR 3, albeit with native anti-aliasing. The 6500 XT hits 79 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 65 and a 0.1% low of 40. This was a bit of a test run starting from the outside of Armadillo and working our way into the town. The 580 also held its own with 75 FPS, so 4 frames per second lower on average, and similar percentile lows to that of the 6500 XT, 62 compared to 65 and 37 compared to 40. Again, a valiant effort from the RX 580 in 2025 despite the lack of modern driver support. It's interesting to note as well that despite having double the VRAM, it doesn't always mean it's going to beat the 6500 XT, which has just 4 gigs. As I said, there is an 8GB variant available, and I will test that as soon as I can find one, but here in the UK, it's basically a card in name only at this point. Next up, we have Starfield. This definitely fared better with the newer card. Again, despite the VRAM limitation on the 6500 XT, we're seeing 39 FPS with a 1% low of 31 and a 0.1% low of 25. Took a walk around Aquila here, a pretty intensive little city in this game. Well, the whole game's pretty intensive, especially on lower end and entry level hardware, but I think 39 FPS is definitely playable considering the game and considering we're not using any form of upscaling. The RX 580 certainly suffered more with just 29 FPS, so there were moments when we peaked above 30 frames per second, but not very often, and the 1 and 0.1% lows meant that this was a rather inconsistent gameplay experience. I apologise if you can hear one of my dog's feet in the background. He's running up and down the living room for some reason in search of... What are you looking for? I believe he's looking for a ball, which he has put down somewhere and lost. Anyway, moving on, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6, 1080p balanced. For the 6500 XT, it's 82 frames per second, a 1% low of 57 and a 0.1% low of 54. Rupert, I don't have your ball. I do not have your ball. Now this was a massive improvement over the RX 580, which hit 50 frames per second with a 1% low of 37 and a 0.1% low of 35. So we're definitely going to need some upscaling here. This is probably the biggest difference we've actually seen today. Whether or not this is a driver issue for the 580, but the 6500 XT certainly produced some superior results here. The difference was actually night and day. I want to mention Microsoft Flight Simulator next. You'll notice I have footage for just the one card. This is because it did not launch on the 580, and that's worth bearing in mind as well, that as we move forward, some games might just flat out refuse to work. I've also noticed this with Spider-Man 2, and that's another one I didn't benchmark because it simply would not work. Now, it has received an update recently, Spider-Man 2, and it does let us launch the game and load the latest save game, but we still can't actually play. It just completely freezes up. Let's finalise with Cyberpunk 2077 then, 1080p with the medium preset this time around. So this is a mixture of all the settings really. It doesn't just change everything to medium. There are a few options on low and a few on high as well. Pretty demanding for both cards. The 6500 XT hit 43 frames per second with our custom benchmark run here. A 1% low of 32 and a 0.1% low of 23. So I think the VRAM limitation certainly impacted our performance. But having said that, the RX 580, despite hitting a similar average, 42, a 1% low of 34, actually came off worse with the 0.1% figure of just 13. So out of these two cards, which would I pick? Well, these aren't the only two options available for less than $100 or pounds, and I think that's important to remember. The 580, you'd have to consider that the driver support isn't there anymore. There may be a few games that refuse to start. For example, if you want to play Flight Simulator or Spider-Man 2, you're going to have a problem at the moment. I'm not sure if there's going to be more driver updates or what, but the 6500 XT ran everything. It started and ran everything. Not with a higher frame rate all of the time, but it's probably the more sensible option out of the two. If you can find an 8GB card, even better. If you're paying a lot for it though, then it's definitely not worth purchasing. I've seen some 8GB 6500 XTs in the States that are similar money to an RX 6600, and at that point, that's certainly the better choice in the price bracket. But at this price point, there are other options as well. It's worth looking around. I mean, you're probably going to find older 1070s for similar money, which are still pretty decent. You're still getting driver support there. 1660s, you know, these aren't the only two options, but out of these two, well, it's going to be a mixed bag of results, but ultimately the 6500 XT will come out on top. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this comparison. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you use either of these two cards and how you feel about them in 2025, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.